Our next guest is one of my favorite people. We're always delighted to have her on the show. We're always grateful when she takes the time to speak with us. Terry O'Neill is an attorney. She is a social reformer. She is president of the National Organization for Women, and we are delighted you're with us, Terry. Thanks for joining us.
Great to talk with you again.
Well, listen, there's so much to talk about that it's rough to know in a way where to begin. But this is not our main topic. But I do want to just briefly touch on the fact that in a week where the nation has been horrified and shocked, perhaps more than we should be, by the details in the torture report. One of the things that struck me about the Senate torture report, and has struck me in the past about the issue of torture, is the fact that in our culture, one of the chief ways of trying to break the will of men in these types of situations seems to be by feminizing them. That was one of the takeaways I had, or by using the feminine dimensions of their lives as seen in this culture as a way of weakening them, threatening to rape their mothers or whatever, all that. In some way, did you feel that this torture report reflected a kind of ongoing assault on women?
RJ, I think that's a really absolutely right insight. The rape as a tool of war, right, has been an issue for a very long time. The UN has been grappling with it. Women's organizations have been advocating that we recognize that rape is used in wartime as a weapon. And I think that the utilization of rape is actually just part of the larger frame that you just talked about, which is that the idea of emasculating someone is kind of the same as feminizing them. That plays right into this very dangerous misogyny, and it is yet another aspect of the horrific system that was in place at the CIA, and we don't know how much of it remains in place at the CIA.
And what we do know is that the United States government, the taxpayer, you and I, and everyone, most people listening, paid $80 million to a psychological consulting firm whose name is a long name, but I call them Monsters Incorporated. And they apparently concluded that this form of behavior would be effective. So somehow there is a shared cultural belief in this power. So I just wanted to mention that and introduce that into the conversation because with all the dimensions of the horror of this torture issue that have been discussed, I haven't seen that one discussed. Now, you've been talking a lot, as many of us have, Terry O'Neill, about the UVA reporting and the situation there. And what's your latest understanding of what's going on, and what should people know and be reflecting on about that story?
Well, there's so many levels to it. I think one that's very important that I think is fascinating is the response of fraternities and the Greek system sort of around the country. Interestingly, some, not all, but some national fraternities and sororities really went on the attack against the president of UVA for calling a suspension of all Greek activities on the UVA campus until January 9th. They demanded an apology. They demanded an immediate reinstatement of all fraternity and sorority events. And yet, the fraternities on the UVA campus said, no, we actually need this suspension. We need to take a step back and take a really clear look at what in the world is going on with campus rape right here at the University of Virginia. So I was heartened by that. The fact remains that the Rolling Stones' multiple journalistic lapses have resulted in, a terribly unfortunate and all too familiar pattern around rape. The rape denialists immediately go into the weeds and start pulling apart this part of the victim's story and that part, and this doesn't work and that doesn't make any sense, and so forth. And they lose sight of the fact that college campuses generally, it's by no means only the University of Virginia, but college campuses generally have a major problem with sexual assault, and collectively as a country, we absolutely need to pay attention to that. You know, RJ, the Rolling Stone article talked about the statistics, talked about the larger problem of rape on campus and the university's response to incidents of rape, and yet the sort of the coverage of the article has really been almost exclusively about, and you see some outlets covering the article saying that the article was only about Jackie, the woman
Right.
that they called Jackie and her story. Clearly, the article was about far more than Jackie. And I'll just make one final point, and that is that I absolutely believe Jackie. Yes, of course her story has holes in it. That is the nature of rape trauma. There's some fascinating research that we now have access to talking about how victims of trauma, not exclusively sexual trauma, their brain literally is rewired by the hormonal response to a devastating traumatic event, so that the memory becomes fragmented, becomes disjointed. It's very difficult for people to reach back and get and make the memory of the entire event make sense. So the fact that she is inconsistent and disjointed is actually an indication that yes, that she was subjected to an overwhelming and devastating trauma.
And we're talking with Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women, about the UVA rape story in Rolling Stone. And, you know, it's interesting because one of the other details, and I want to get back to the bigger picture, but one of the other details, besides the overwhelming statistics about the frequency of campus rape, one of the other details that came out in the coverage was that one of the friends of Jackie, as she's called, who was interviewed in an attempt to get to the bottom of the story, said something happened to her that night. And this was not a friend who necessarily claimed any special knowledge of the rape itself, but said she was traumatized that night. I mean, there's no question about that, which also supports her story. But it gets to the question, one of the aspects of this that I think needs further discussion is why so many people, primarily males, but not exclusively, are invested in this tactic of discrediting by anecdote the very compelling statistics of campus rape that I'm sure if you asked any one of them, they would not say that they defend the idea of rape, and yet they're defending some category of privilege that seems to encompass the idea that one is able to rape under certain circumstances. I can't come to another interpretation of their behavior than that. Can you?
Yeah, RJ, I think there's just a lot of things going on, and the one good thing about this whole Rolling Stone article is that it is not happening in a vacuum. There's a lot of action from Congress, from the White House on sexual assault, both in the military and on college campuses. We have a lot of public attention now being paid to domestic violence in professional sports. So this is a moment when I think people are beginning to see the larger picture, and it's not just about this Rolling Stone story. I have to tell you, I think that at least amongst women, there's a very understandable tendency and a desire to isolate a rape victim. Sometimes psychologically, the way it works is, she must have done something wrong. She must be different from me. I don't want to believe this could ever happen to me. So I have to help myself believe that she was dressed wrong and she was lying or she deserved it or something. You see that sort of mindset going on with women.
And is that... And we're going to have to, take a break in a second, but maybe when we come back, I guess the question I would want to ask you about that before we move on to the men is, can that be when people feel powerless, or traumatized? One of the ways, for example, that they take, according to psychological studies that I've read, they take back their power by assuming that somehow it's their fault or the fault of another person in a similar position, because it almost creates a false sense of empowerment that creates a sense of security in a way. So as part of the task, and we'll talk about this when we come back, Terry O'Neill, is part of the task to help that kind of a woman understand how to really address a problem like this. So maybe we can think about that. And if I'm off base, you'll tell me. We will be right back after this message with Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour. And we are back on the Zero Hour. I'm Richard RJ Eskow. We're talking with Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women. And we were talking before the break about, the women who have at times blamed or isolated other women who have been rape victims. And I was wondering whether, in a sense, that was a form of psychological self-protection, a way of somehow assuming a greater sense of power over the circumstance. Is that off base, you think, Terry? Or
yeah, no, I don't think it's off base at all. I think there's no end to human beings' ability to engage in magical thinking, and sometimes that's how you get up in the morning, is to have those kind of psychological mechanisms. What we need to do is be aware of them, that that's what they are, and not allow ourselves to be guided by them. And so just to give you two statistics and then flip those statistics around, we know, or at least the best information that we have is that about 1 in 4 women on college campuses will be raped sometime during their college career. We also know that something less, so maybe between 6% and 8%, something like that, of men on college campuses will commit rape. Now let's flip those statistics around. 75% of women never experience sexual assault during their college years, and over 90% of men never commit rape on campus. Right? So we're talking about these psychological mechanisms where it's mostly bystander men, who don't want to believe that this could possibly happen, who become very defensive when the whole subject of rape comes up, because actually, when women talk about rape, they become very, very angry. And that anger can be difficult for bystander men who've never committed rape to deal with. And they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to believe that it could happen. They belong to fraternities, and they don't want to believe that of their fraternity brothers. So you have this whole sort of, it seems like humans are in some ways pre-wired to be defensive and in denial about things. And then on top of that, something that has recently really become very crystal clear to me, as college campuses and professional sports organizations and military units are trying to grapple with what do they do when within their ranks they have abusers. What do you do about the abuser? Well, what we keep talking about is how much like the criminal justice system should the college campus be, should the sports organization be, should the military unit be, and I think that's all wrong. I'm beginning to think that organizations that harbor abusers or rapists need to respond by putting the victim at the center of their response. Just give you an example on college campuses. Instead of worrying about, all the due process, but also all the correct punishment for the rapist, let's first and foremost ensure that the victim is able to continue her college career in safety, security, and freedom. Freedom from fear. So if that means removing him from the campus, that's not the same as going to jail. There's no due process. This is not nearly the same level of due process that would be required. You get him off campus. Let him be homeschooled, for example. Anything, whatever it takes to ensure that she gets to have total freedom and that she begins to thrive again on campus. So what we know right now is the vast majority of college women who are raped drop out while the vast majority of their rapists continue their 4-year college career and graduate. We need
Well,
to flip that script.
let me just jump in for a second. Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women, with a couple thoughts. One is, first of all, I think your inversion of the statistics makes a lot of sense. I think a lot, and the defensiveness angle makes a lot of sense. And I was also thinking, as you were talking about this potential solution of isolating the man from the campus while it's being investigated, I was trying to imagine what the response would be. And among defenders, for lack of a better term, of the status quo, certainly. And I could imagine them saying, well, but wait a minute, this guy, it's not proven he did anything wrong. And I was thinking, yeah, but then you would say, well, okay, he was at a party where there was perhaps excessive drinking and drug taking. He was in a compromising situation. Why are you giving him a higher standard of protection than you are giving a woman who is possibly been raped? But when all we hear is, well, she shouldn't have been there. She shouldn't have been dressed that way. She shouldn't have been compromising herself. But I can see people coming back and doing that. And I think there's another dimension of this debate too, which is that I think I do think, and I'm curious your thoughts, but from the male perspective, I do think, and I celebrate this, that our definition of rape is evolving to, as a society, to reflect reality. And some of us remember, for example, to bring Bill Cosby into the equation, his Spanish Fly routine of the 1960s. That was socially acceptable to joke about drugging women in order to seduce them. And even though most men had the decency not to do that sort of thing in college, there wasn't the level of common understanding that is in fact rape. So I think as the definition shifts, isn't it possible that some people just become frightened because they don't know where the new boundary is and they need to be taught?
Yeah, there's that dimension of it too. I want to go very quickly to the first thing you mentioned. You know, from criminal law, we know that we want the accused to have the benefit of innocence, a presumption of innocence until proven guilty. But what that translates to, what I see it translating to all too often in rape cases, is that she then becomes guilty until she can prove herself innocent of essentially a crime. RJ, right? Because it's a crime to commit perjury. It's a crime to obstruct justice. You tell a lie to an investigating police officer, you're obstructing justice, that's a crime. She should have the benefit of the presumption of innocence of lying, right? And yet, what we do is we take the presumption of innocence for the man and twist that into a presumption of guilt for the woman. And we've got to figure out how not to do that. In terms of the sort of the changing nature of the boundaries and so forth, yeah, I mean, wow, that whole Spanish Fly thing with Bill Cosby, and then it turns out this is exactly the kind of behavior that he's been engaging in and devastating women for years. Really sort of creepy, but the evolving mores, I mean, honestly, I think most men are actually more than capable of handling these evolving mores, and it's not so much the being able to verbalize your sexual desire to a partner is just an important thing that adults have to be able to do, and I think they can get through that. What I think is a little bit more difficult is the larger problem of the relation between men and women. We are not in a post-patriarchal society. We still live in a patriarchal society, and a patriarchal society is one in which men simply, at the extreme, men simply own women. Now, we're not there anymore, but we're not sufficiently extricated from that mindset, and I think that it's that sexual relations are simply an example of patriarchal relations, and that's the piece that men and women, frankly, are having a slightly more difficult time, negotiating.
And, we're talking to Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women. That's an interesting dimension, I think. I wonder if that bleeds into the rape conversation in any indirect way. I mean, obviously, I don't think, I think even in the 1960s, if we had known about Bill Cosby's behavior, there would have been horror. But I think that I'm wondering whether, you know, the dimension of this campus rape conversation that has to do with, well, should college women party? You know, should they go to parties? How should they dress? How should they say no? I mean, the outrage at the Antioch rules about asking permission before move, isn't it all somehow connected?
Definitely connected. And in fact, I am a big supporter of California's yes means yes requirements on college campuses. I think they're wonderful. Now, it would work a lot better and much more easily if in the public schools we had comprehensive, intelligent, age-appropriate sex education that included a segment on relationships and relationship violence and relationship coercion. A really good sex education program encompasses all of that. And a very small number of schools around the country do provide it. Most do not. So the yes means yes rules work really well if accompanied by adequate sex education coming up. But yeah, it's really not about whether she says no, it's about whether she consented. Did she say yes? Right? And
Right.
And that needs to be, it took years and decades, in fact, but the FBI finally, about 2 or 3 years ago, or 4, finally updated its definition of rape. And now the definition is, a quote, penetration, however slight, without consent.
Mm-hmm.
Not against her will, but without consent. So she has no obligation to affirmatively say no. He has the obligation to obtain consent.
Right. I mean, and this may sound like a banal comparison to something as horrifying as rape, but, if somebody steals my wallet, there doesn't have to be proof that I said, no, please don't take my money. I mean, the taking of my money is the crime. In the same way, somehow this notion of a lack of denial of permission, it just seems to me so antiquated and bizarre, and only because it has to do with women's bodies.
Yes, I know it's astonishing. But we are making progress. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's suddenly when women's bodies are the subject of the criminal behavior, suddenly the rules all change. Well, that's a vestige of a patriarchal mindset, and we are pulling away from it. It's just taking time.
Well, I appreciate the positive note, and I do think it's true. I mean, look, the world has changed since, and it continues to change, and we thank you, Terry O'Neill, for your work in continuing that change process, and we hope you'll come back and join us.
Thanks, RJ. Anytime.
I appreciate it. We've been talking with Terry O'Neill, president of the National Organization for Women. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.